And welcome to Chapter 15 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is titled, What is Freedom? New Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. So this is the period directly following the Civil War, and this is the period where the nation was trying to mend itself back together as a full union rather than the United States and the Confederate States. So what exactly is Reconstruction? It is just as it sounds. It's attempting to reunite and reconstruct the nation following the devastation of the Civil War. And this was, we've talked a lot about the psychological damage that was done, the pitting of one side against the other, but this translated to physical devastation as well. So the landscape was devastated, the infrastructure was devastated, and even though it was being improved and added upon, many spots were completely destroyed. And the meaning of freedom changed to include the freed slaves. So this was not an easily accepted concept in either the North or the South, especially in the South. But the idea of equality was still out of reach for most people. Obviously, the South struggled with this more because their entire society had been based on the subjugation of a group of people who were now freed, and they had to figure out what to do with that. So not only the free people needed to figure out what they were going to do for work and how they were going to interact with the society that had enslaved them for years, the white people also had to figure out what they were going to do with a freed population that they felt no responsibility to help them progress. So 1865 to 1877 encompasses two major phases. There's the presidential reconstruction, and then there's also radical reconstruction. So we'll talk about both of those. Family and social life during Reconstruction, following the Civil War, many African American families attempted to locate their family members who they'd been separated from during the Second Middle Passage or during the war. So we talked about the Second Middle Passage as being this great movement of African Americans and enslaved people from the east to the deep south and to the west. And oftentimes families had been split up during this process. So people were attempting to move throughout the country to find their lost loved ones. Widows of soldiers were receiving pensions, and this meant that they no longer had their male partner, obviously, but they were receiving some money in the acknowledgement that there would likely be no income for that family without the male. The structure of the economic setting on a national basis was still such that women were not making nearly enough money to support a family, and they were certainly making vast amounts less than men. Gender roles from white society was adopted by African Americans, with men being the head of household and going to work, with the hopes that the women would eventually be able to stay home. Many people saw this as a sign of high civility if women were able to stay home and the man made enough money to supply his entire family with everything that they needed. Eventually, though, most black women needed to go to work because the wages that black men were receiving weren't high enough to support a family. And what also happened following the war was that schools were established by Northern missionaries, the Freedmen's Bureau, and ex-slaves. So the Freedmen's Bureau was the government group in charge of helping freed black people to settle into society and to find gainful work and to find education for their children. African Americans also notably created more churches of their own. The Methodist and the Baptist Church were the most popular, and there were about 250 Black ministers who held political office during Reconstruction. So the church was a very central part of Black society at this point, and that's evidenced by Black ministers holding political appointments and voted in by the people. Churches were not only used for worship, but they were also used for school, for social events, and political events and discussions. So the building itself was a hub for a centralized gathering space for African Americans following the war. With regard to political freedoms, the vote was still seen as the ultimate freedom, as well as property ownership. But definitely the vote was a thing that people kept talking about, and they used emotional arguments to sort of get at the core of it. Not having the vote was a sign of being a second-class citizen. So people felt that if they couldn't vote, that their thoughts and opinions didn't necessarily matter, and that they weren't being treated as a full citizen. Foner states, self-ownership, family stability, religious liberty, political participation, and economic autonomy were the major goals for people following the war. And Black Americans began celebrating the 4th of July and asked for soldier sacrifices to be recognized. So following the war, following African American participation in the armed forces, they wanted to be recognized for the sacrifices that they had made as well. And they felt that they were being overrun by the white narrative to the story. Black men were beginning to serve in public office at this point. So it was a huge change for the country that had historically made it such that African American men would not and could not be in a position of authority. So being able to be part of the national government or even the state government, let alone the local government, was a huge change, and especially in the South where there were large Black populations, and that meant that there would be more Black representatives, more Black senators, and more state senators, and more local officials who were African American men. The Freedmen's Bureau, as we mentioned a little bit before, existed to support the newly freed and formerly enslaved population. So this existed for 5 years following the Civil War until 1870. They established schools. They dealt with aid for the poor and those who were old, and they settled disputes between Blacks and whites. So the court system was still not particularly keen on dealing with issues in which one side was white and one side was Black. So the Freedmen's Bureau often intervened in these cases. What they also strove to do was secure equal treatment before the law. So the courts weren't particularly adept at this yet, as I just mentioned, but they were trying to work towards that, and they were trying to figure out how the laws should be written and interpreted going forward. Healthcare and hospitals, including the administration of drugs, was a huge contribution that the Freedmen's Bureau was making. So healthcare had been off limits to most enslaved people unless the person who owned them decided that they were worth something to them and could receive medical treatment. Land reform was also a concern at this point, because if freedom was established by land ownership, and in some states if your voting was established by land ownership, the right to own land would be of enormous import. So the land reform refers to dividing into 40-acre plots was the most commonly referred to thing. So this is 40 acres and a mule. This is if this didn't happen, it meant that African Americans would be forced to go back to work for white property owners, oftentimes the ones that they had been enslaved by. And this meant that having land was key to continuing their freedom. So if they'd been granted this freedom, in order to really live that out, they would need their own property and their own ability to farm for themselves, or the freedom to choose otherwise and go work for somebody if they wanted to. It shouldn't be their only and last resort, is the argument here. The sharecropping system pops up as extremely popular during this point, and it's based on this task labor and supervised wage labor structure. These were the regular forms of employment that existed at this point. So task labor, meaning if you completed your task, you could move on to something else. Supervised wage labor meant that you would be working for an hourly wage. Cotton and tobacco, which were these huge crops that were previously taken in by enslaved people, were now sharecropped. So this meant that a person would rent part of a plantation, and whatever they grew, whatever they harvested, would be divided between the owner and the renter at the end of the year. So they would do all the work, and then whoever technically owned the land would get half of the profits from that. White farmers ended up sharecropping as well, because many of them were unable to make it on their own after the war too. So following economic devastation in the South, this is what many people had to resort to, not just the newly freed people, but also the people on the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. Crop lien is another concept that's embedded within this, and it's using part of the crop as collateral to obtain a loan to purchase things from merchants. But then you need to continually get more loans. The present day representation of this that you might think of is payday loan services that you see. So people need money ahead of time, but then the interest is so great that they continually need to take out more loans in order to pay off the last. So this is this vicious cycle. You can see the bottom right-hand corner here has this visualization of it. So it's the sharecropper cycle of poverty. Step 1, the sharecropper is provided land and seed in exchange. He promises the landowner half of the crop, and the sharecropper buys food and clothing on credit from a landowner's store, and then the sharecropper plants and harvests the crop. The sharecropper gives landowner crop to sell. The sharecropper will get half of the earnings minus the cost of his purchases for the year. And then when settling up, the landowner says the sharecropper owns more than he has earned, and in order to pay the debt, the sharecropper has to promise the landowner a greater share of the next year's crop. So it's this cycle that doesn't seem like it has a way out necessarily, because people need things to live off while they're farming, and then it's this cycle of debt. For white Southerners, there are many considerations following the war as well. There were about 260,000 dead Confederates, which was about 1/5 of the adult white males in the South. So 20% of the adult white males in the South were dead following the war. There was no more slave labor. Much of the land that they had been farming on had been destroyed. There were, in conjunction with that, there were many dead farm animals as well. And the non-functioning infrastructure was particularly crippling, because to rebuild these these lands and to ship in more animals, you would need the infrastructure to do that. And without that, it just meant that the economy basically had to go through an entire overhaul. There was nothing that survived particularly well through this. What happened, though, was that this hierarchy, this racial hierarchy, was maintained following the war. So many white Southerners were acting as if freedom was a privilege and not a right. And this was a different set of thoughts than had existed before, where they had inalienable rights and God-given rights and that sort of thing. And they were saying that that was no longer the case and that you had to earn freedom. Foner is quoted as saying, blacks were free, but free only to labor. So this meant that they had been technically freed, but they certainly weren't equal in the eyes of the law or in the eyes of those living in society with them. And they were not given the chance to rise up throughout the socioeconomic strata. The idea throughout the South was that whites felt that they were now on the bottom of the hierarchy following the war, as it had humiliated them and changed their entire structure of living. They wanted to ensure that there were still other people below them on this heap of people, so they wouldn't be considered the worst of the worst. So they many times the less economically advantaged Southern whites would make sure to ramp up racist rhetoric and attempt to prevent freed black people from participating in public life. Cities saw vast improvement at this point, and they saw connections to the north and trade markets via the railroad system, which was expanding and being repaired following the war. So southern cities were starting to see a boom, even if rural southern areas were still struggling or had even increased struggles added to them. Land, control of labor, and political power were the major concerns for most people in the South. So access to farming land and control of the labor force, so dictating who could work where and when and for how much, and political power was a great concern because in the South, there were freed African Americans being voted into office for the first time. And this was startling for many of the white Southerners at this point. Well, it's an obvious improvement in our heads today. Women and children were taken out of manual labor positions and put to inside work if they needed to be working. So there was an attempt to reestablish these gender spheres in the face of everything sort of having fallen apart. If they could establish some recognizable parts of their society, they might be able to get a better foothold. Many of the formerly money-making enterprises fell apart with many plantations failing in their current state and being split up into several parcels of land. So it was hard for that planter society that existed in the antebellum period to continue following the war because the lack of money and the lack of labor didn't necessarily lend itself to these large-scale plantations. The right to vote for African Americans, including the formerly enslaved population of men, was a surprise to many in the Western Hemisphere. So this right to vote being extended and right to run for public office was surprising. Many people didn't think that this that this would take place, and certainly didn't think that it would take place so soon after the war, if they did think that it would happen. Because remember, even those who were in favor of ending slavery as an institution, many of them still didn't believe that freed African Americans would be able to integrate well into society, or that they should receive the same rights as white Americans. So we'll move on to the technicalities of what Reconstruction is. So a lot of those are the social changes and vast economic changes that you see, and the political repercussions of this era will come here. So presidential Reconstruction is the first phase of Reconstruction. President Andrew Johnson oversaw this part of Reconstruction, and the number one objective was restoration of the Union. So pulling the United States and the Confederate States together back into just the United States. He was in favor of allowing the South to pursue states' rights rather than dictating from the Capitol. So he thought that many of the legal constructs could be decided at the state level rather than at the federal level, even if slavery had to remain illegal. So this is the 2-year period from 1865 to 1867 that Andrew Johnson is covering for this presidential Reconstruction. Part of what he also did was pardon white Southerners who had pledged allegiance to the United States, and he excluded Confederate leaders and the ultra-wealthy. Jefferson Davis was actually jailed for 2 years following the war until he was pardoned. Johnson also demanded that slavery remain illegal, and he said that secession needed to remain abolished. So slavery no more Confederate states, and he left it up to the states, and this led to violence. So when people couldn't decide how something should be reconstructed following the war, people began to fight with each other, not only verbally, but also by using violence. And this required oversight by the Union forces. So the southern states were occupied at this point as well. Eventually, Andrew Johnson is actually impeached by the House of Representatives. He's not removed from office by the Senate, which requires a 2/3 majority. There has been talk of this in the last couple of decades, where people wanted the president to be impeached. So this has been explained over and over again in recent times. But you can, in fact, be impeached by the House of Representatives, but not removed from office by the Senate. So he was impeached because of his non-compliance with the tenure of office rules for the Secretary of War. So basically, on a technicality, he's impeached, but not removed from office. The Black Codes are laws regulating freedmen's behavior. So these are laws that go against African American people following the war. It did allow for a few things. It allowed for marriage, property ownership, but it did limit the access to the courts. It was seen as expanding access to the courts at this point, but it was a very small access window, and this is where the Freedmen's Bureau comes in to help adjudicate things that needed to go to court. What the Black Codes did was deny many more things than it actually allowed. So Black people were not allowed to testify against white people. They were not allowed to serve on juries. they were not allowed to join militias, and they were not allowed to vote in some cases. The vote was extended in some southern states, and it was extended in northern states, but in some states, they were still not allowed to vote under these black codes. Those without work could be arrested and sent to work for plantation owners. So because of the limited access to occupations and because of the limited access to education, many people were unable to find work and were then forced to go work for many of the same people who had enslaved them to begin with. Some assigned child labor without parental consent, and this meant that children of African Americans were being maltreated following their freedom as well. So assigning children labor against the wishes of their parents doesn't quite sound like what most of us would consider to be freedom. There were a group of people at this point in the political sphere that called themselves radical Republicans. So what they were hoping to do was oust Confederates from the new governments in the South, because they were going to ensure that the same things happened regardless of whether or not they had their own nation. So those who were voted into power in the South, who had been there before, were tending towards the same ideas that they had had prior to the South's surrender. Radical Republicans were wanting to ensure that this didn't happen. They were wanting to keep former Confederate politicians from rising up in the ranks again and running into the same problems. Radical Republicans fought for allowing black men to have the vote. So it was important to them that if they were free people, if they were free men specifically, that they would have access to the vote. Equality for all, regardless of race, was a standpoint that many people took who were associated with this movement, and that included the right to vote, serve on juries, use the courts, and all other rights associated with being a white male American at the time. And redistribution of land was a common topic for people, because how do you get more land divided up for people if you don't necessarily want to move west or don't have the ability to move west? So redistribution of land belonging to disloyal planters was controversial, but it did start to happen. And there was a strong belief in property rights that we've talked about over and over and over again that caused us to drag on. And it wasn't ever fully achieved, because taking people's land away from them, if they were white American men, was seen as somewhat blasphemous. We start to see what becomes the origin of civil rights. So most Republicans at the time wanted to modify presidential Reconstruction rather than scrap it, because they thought that people wouldn't go along with former slaves being able to vote. So they wanted to change things about this Reconstruction rather than create their own. There were two bills of importance with regards to civil rights at this point. There was the interest in extending the Freedmen's Bureau, which was vetoed, and the Civil Rights Bill, which was vetoed but overturned. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866 stated that all those born in the United States were citizens, there was equality before the law, and Johnson vetoed this because he didn't think that black men should have citizenship rights, and he believed that the states should make their own laws with this. This was the first major law to have the 2/3 majority to overturn the presidential veto and make it into law over the president's protest. So, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 states that all those born in the United States were citizens and that there should be some measure of equality before the law. And that passed over presidential objection. The 14th Amendment states that citizenship for all born in the United States, that citizenship is granted to all those born in the United States, and that the federal government is allowed to ensure the amendment's enforcement if states are not holding up their end of this agreement. So if the states denied citizenship to freed African Americans, the nation, the federal government could come in and enforce this freedom, essentially. African Americans were allowed to vote, but they voted and got the right to vote under threat of losing seats in Congress. So white politicians in the South were being threatened with losing seats in Congress for their state if they were not allowing African Americans to vote and run for office as well. The Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 military regions, so you can see those in the top right-hand corner picture here. And this was a creation of new state governments. Black men were given the right to vote, and this was again over Johnson's veto. And this is the beginning of radical Reconstruction, which lasted for a decade, from 1867 to 1877. And there was the attempt that we talked about to impeach Johnson. It was one vote short in the Senate to have him removed from office. The 15th Amendment from February 1869 prohibited state and federal government from denying the vote because of race. And this meant literacy tests, poll taxes, property qualifications, and gender were all ways to get around that. So if you couldn't deny somebody coming in based on their race, you could deny somebody coming in based on them not being able to read something out loud to you, or based on them not being able to pay to enter the polls, or because they didn't own land, or because they were a woman. And these were all ways that people set up to deny the vote to women and black men. Women's rights, as we talked about, had sort of naturally expanded during the war. Women had more access to the public sphere. They had more access to jobs. They had started this movement in requesting educational benefits and requesting that they be able to enter the workforce as they saw fit. And this movement continued to grow. And women, once again, suggested that while changes were being made to the Constitution, perhaps women should be included as well. So we saw the letters between the Adams, and we saw that Abigail Adams had told her husband, remember the ladies too. And this sort of sentiment continues here. They were concerned with free labor, meaning the right to work and earn wages. They were concerned with their right to seek a divorce. And they were also concerned with maintaining rights to their own bodies. And we talked about this with hoping for the end of coverture laws, in which they'd be able to legally represent themselves and also maintain security over their own bodies and their own thoughts. Male supporters of women's rights wanted to focus on black men's rights rather than take women's rights into consideration at the same time. So even if they did agree that women should have these rights, they said maybe not right now. We need to focus on black men getting their rights first and integrating black people into society that way before they could focus on women's rights. This is a leftover issue from the abolitionist movement, where we had talked about that schism between men and women over women's place in this society. There was a split not only between men and women, but within women's rights groups themselves. So some women ended up using racism and racist rhetoric to suggest that native-born white women were more capable than blacks or immigrants in order to speed up their access to the vote and other legal benefits. So some white women were saying that they were deserving of the vote, but still attempting to throw other people under the bus, essentially, in order to show that they were higher up and that they were more deserving. Some believed that they should still support the rights for African American men because it was a step in the right direction, even if it didn't necessarily benefit them directly. So they saw this constant pursuit of universal rights as the way to go, and if it was expanding for somebody else and not necessarily them at the exact same time, that had to be okay. The two main groups that split off were the National Women's Suffrage Association, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the leader. This was the older and more traditional approach. And the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, this was the younger and more radical approach. And appeals to religion and the natural way of things were continued to be used to keep women down. And this is a popular tactic throughout history to go against oppressed groups. And if someone claims that they're naturally or scientifically less able or less capable, people are more willing to listen to that and consider that. And if people bring religion into it, that's often an entire emotional and psychological challenge, and it forms a stronger sense of what is right and what is wrong in people's heads, even if the information that they've received was obviously not universally beneficial or humanitarian. Radical Reconstruction in the South looked like many different things. So it included sit-ins, protests, strikes, and lecture tours. And they used all of these tactics in order to get information out that the laws were in African American men's favor finally, and that they should take advantage of these new opportunities. So you can see this picture on the right here is the first, what it says is the first colored senator and representatives. So these are the first African American participants in government at the higher levels in the United States. Many of these campaigns took place where African American men were registered to vote. So they had these group meetings where they were trying to register people to vote. Obviously, this is a staging area for white supremacists who would then come in and attempt to scare black men away from registering to vote. In 1868 and 1869, there were public funding initiatives for facilities like schools, asylums, jails, and orphanages. And these were expanded into African American society at this point, trying to build up from within. What Radical Reconstruction also did was do away with whipping and jailing for debts and property requirements for office holders. So you did not need to own property in order to take public office. And about 2,000 black office holders took office during this time. Pinckney B.S. Pinchback was the Louisiana governor, and he was actually the last African American governor of Louisiana until 1989. And he was the son of a formerly enslaved woman and the plantation owner who had been her owner. So he was of mixed heritage, And there started to be a different understanding of the level of blackness, as they would put it, or the level of whiteness, as you would put it. And people started to think about the nuance of different situations and who people's parents were and how they got there. But typically it was extreme racism in a very just bald and obvious form. We do have a couple of fun words that people got called. These aren't great things, but they're fun words. So we have carpetbaggers, which were Northerners who went to the South following the war to sort of reap the benefits of this chaos. And in reality, it was soldiers who had stayed in the South and had not returned to the North. But they were trying to benefit off this chaotic situation in the South. And scalawags were Southern-born Republicans who had sided with the Union during the war. And these are kind of like what you think of as the loyalists following the Revolutionary War. So they were people who had fought for the Union, like those who had established the Free State of Jones that we talked about last week, or in the last lecture. Southern Republicans passed a number of laws in favor of African Americans, but there's still a legal versus social reality to contend with. So the laws were in place to attempt to ensure equal rights. It's the beginning of that idea. But the people who were living there weren't necessarily following suit. So they were attempting to circumvent the laws and still prevent Black participation in political issues. There were many opponents to Reconstruction, as you might imagine and as you've most certainly heard of. Planters, merchants, and Southern Democrats were often opposed to the way Reconstruction had played out because it took away many of the advantages people had held if they were a planter, a merchant, or a political figure. And there were examples of Black supremacy allowing, or excuse me, there were supposed examples of what they called Black supremacy, where they thought that by allowing for protection under the law and for access to service in the government, these were examples of moving people up over white people who could have filled these roles. There were rising taxes for public amenities like schools and the railroad, which made a lot of people really angry following the war because there was a lot of financial devastation during the war. And if you had to pay higher taxes following that, that just compounded the devastation. Former slaves were voting and holding office, and that was too much psychologically for many whites in the South. They couldn't stomach the idea that their lives had been completely turned upside down, and it was so drastic that many people couldn't take it in and lashed out violently. The KKK is one of the more famous groups that reacted this way. Instead of embracing the universal rights that were being presented and being talked about, they decided that the way things had worked for them, and they wanted to go back to that. So violence was widespread for opponents of Reconstruction. They had a goal of preventing African Americans from voting, and they had a goal of enacting political assassinations of white Republicans who had supported the radical Reconstruction agenda. So they were going after African American families, and they were also going after whites who were living in the South and were supporting this new system. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, was established in 1866 in Tennessee. And these were terrorists who targeted Unionists, teachers, Republicans, and obviously, most notably, African Americans. And this wasn't limited to men alone, it was entire families who were oftentimes killed. In 1871, in Meridian, Mississippi, you had 30 African Americans and a white judge who were murdered by the Klan. This is one of the more famous mass murders that they had committed as a group during this time, during Reconstruction. And a couple years later, in Colfax, Louisiana, there were hundreds of former slaves who were murdered, including militia people who had surrendered. And the Klan actually had a brief hiatus, but we know it came back, and they actually still exist as a group today and continue their reign of terror, and they're a recognized hate group today. Even those who weren't vehemently opposed to Reconstruction started to tire of the whole process. So with the dying out of the radical Republicans, these people who were wanting to remake the South and wanting to establish this new country moving forward with more universal rights, with them dying out, the country was left with a more moderate, middle-of-the-road version. So there was a rise in elitism, once again pushing democracy out. So those who had money kept flowing into positions of power. And many blame the economic situation in the South on Black leadership in government and called for their removal from office. So it wasn't that there had been economic problems before the war and the war added to it. They were saying that it was because of Black government. So it was an obvious attempt at banning a particular race from participating in the political system. There was an economic depression in 1873 that took attention away from pursuing freedom, and people were mostly focused on their economic situation. So people were less concerned about the philosophical big ideas, and they were more concerned about their particular situation and where their food was going to be coming from, and if they could provide for their family. There were people who called themselves redeemers, and they were white Southerners, suggesting that they'd redeemed the South in the face of corruption from the North and from African Americans. And this was a red flag, in that, kind of literally and figuratively, in that the Confederates were coming back to power. So those who had been in power and had perpetuated these ideas for the Confederate States of America were gaining office again, and they were gaining ground in society. The bargain of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes was president, recognized the South's control over their own territory and ended military occupation of the region. And the Southern leaders said that they would respect African American rights and political advantages in exchange for being left alone, but obviously this didn't work out. And you can see in the picture over here, it says, "Compromise with the South," and it says, "In memory of Union heroes in a useless war." So it's saying that by making this compromise, it's allowing the Confederate States to once again rise up, in theory, if not technically. So that is where we end for U.S. History 1. So we end with this fall of Reconstruction, this bargain of 1877. This is the end of this period of attempted improvement, and that's not to say we haven't improved as a nation since then. Certainly we have. But it is notable that there was this attempt to rebuild the nation in a particular way, and then in order to maintain the Union, as people saw it, they were willing to set a lot of these concerns aside and essentially throw African Americans aside and attempt to reunite white society in the North and the South. So if you do decide to continue on and take U.S. History 2, there are a bunch of things you would learn about. You took U.S. History 1. This is sort of, you could think of it as the base for moving further on and up till today. So you would start with the end of Reconstruction, which we just landed on, and then you would move into the years following that in the North and South as they were attempting to regain a sense of normalcy and trying to really heal the wounds of the nation, but not paying attention to many of the citizens in the process. And you also talk about the rise of an industrial nation. So you get cars, radios, TV, the internet, all sorts of craziness happens throughout the 20th century, the long 20th century. So the long 20th century is basically the end of the Civil War through now. So it's well beyond the 20th century, but many times they're grouped together in this way. So you would also talk about the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, Desert Storm, 9/11, the Afghanistan War, and the Iraq War. And these are all the wars, or all the major wars that you would see within this time frame leading up till today. And you also learn about many opposition movements against these instances of violence as well. You will learn about women gaining suffrage, finally, and African Americans gaining suffrage in a real and solid way. So we'd talk about the civil rights movement eventually and the women's rights movement. You'd also get to talk about outer space. You get to talk about people sending vehicles into outer space and people themselves going into outer space, which is pretty neat. And basically, you'd cover from the end of this course through right now. And there's a lot to cover. The thing to remember about all of this is that everything is complicated. Things aren't typically black and white. They're not as easy as they seem. And they're on this spectrum of good to bad. So everything is complicated. Keep that in mind. And with that, we have the end of the lectures for U.S. History 1. And you have, to go along with this particular lecture, you have additional Voices of Freedom readings that you need to complete. So we have, to go along with this, we have number 97, which outlines the Mississippi Black Code. Number 99, which is Elizabeth Cady Stanton on home life. You have number 100, which is Frederick Douglass, talking about the composite nation. And number 101, Robert B. Elliott on civil rights. So you will read all of those and write one of your reviews about that. And the final will also be posted shortly, and you will receive an email about that.